Lettie Rhodes had lived 12 years without visitors. Not one. The ranch sat 3 hours from the nearest settlement, hidden between ridges that swallowed sound and kept strangers away. She wanted it that way. So when 10 figures appeared at dawn, walking slowly across her land like they knew exactly where they were going, she gripped the rifle tighter than she'd held anything in years. They weren't lost. They came with purpose. The elder at the front raised both hands, palms open, and said something in a language she barely understood. But one phrase came through clearly, repeated by the woman beside him. "We owe you our lives." Lettie stared. She didn't know these people. She'd never seen their faces. And yet they stood there, waiting, as if she held the answer to a question she'd never been asked. She'd woken that morning the same way she had for over a decade, alone, silent, moving through the motions of survival without thought. Feed the horses, check the fences, boil water, eat something tasteless, avoid mirrors, avoid memories. The house was clean but empty, stripped of anything that could remind her of before. No photographs, no letters, just walls and a roof, and the weight of every single day pressing down like stone. She told herself this was enough. She told herself she deserved nothing more. But now there were 10 people standing outside her door. They carried woven blankets, clay pots, dried herbs bundled in leather cord, offerings. The elder stepped forward again, his weathered face lined with something Lettie hadn't seen in years. Warmth. Real, unguarded warmth. He gestured toward the young woman beside him, who looked no older than 25, with dark braided hair and eyes that glistened with emotion Lettie couldn't name. The woman spoke in halting words, struggling to bridge the language gap. "You saved her. 12 winters passed. She was dying. You brought her, through the cold, to our healer. She lived." The woman placed a hand on her own chest. "I lived." Lettie's throat closed. She shook her head slowly, stepping back. No, that wasn't possible. She didn't remember. She didn't save anyone. The woman took another step forward, desperation flickering across her face. "You don't remember? The storm, the blood. You carried me for hours." The elder spoke again, his voice low and steady, and the woman translated haltingly. He says, "You gave us back what we thought was lost. We searched for you. For years. We owe you everything." Lettie's hands trembled. She wanted to scream at them to leave. She wanted to tell them they were wrong, that they had the wrong person, the wrong story. But something inside her cracked. A splinter of memory. A night of ice and wind. A small body, barely breathing. Blood on her hands, and the unbearable, suffocating weight of knowing she'd been too late for her own child. She slammed the door shut. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Outside, she heard nothing. No footsteps walking away. No voices fading. Just silence. And then, faintly, the sound of something being placed on her doorstep. She pressed her back against the wall, eyes squeezed shut, trying to block out the flood of images threatening to drown her. But the woman's words echoed in her skull, relentless and undeniable. "You saved her." Lettie hadn't saved anyone that mattered. She'd failed. She'd lost everything. So why were they here, claiming she'd given them life? And why, after 12 years of numbness, did it feel like something inside her was breaking open? She stayed there, frozen, until the sun climbed higher. When she finally opened the door again, they were still there, sitting, waiting. The elder met her eyes, and this time she saw it clearly, gratitude so deep it made her chest ache. He spoke again, and the young woman translated softly. "We will not leave until you let us say thank you." Lettie's voice came out raw, broken. "I don't remember." The woman stepped closer, tears streaming down her face. "Then let us help you remember." And in that moment, Lettie realized she wasn't the only one carrying a wound that refused to heal. Lettie stood in the doorway, arms crossed tight against her chest like she could hold herself together through sheer force. The 10 visitors hadn't moved. They sat in a half circle on the dirt, patient as stone. The young woman who claimed Lettie saved her life wiped her eyes and gestured toward the elder. He nodded once, then began pulling something from the leather satchel at his side. A piece of cloth, faded blue, stained dark in places. He held it out toward Lettie with both hands, speaking in his language. The young woman translated haltingly. "This was yours. You wrapped me in it, kept me warm." Lettie's stomach twisted. She recognized the fabric. It had been her daughter's blanket, the one she'd sewn herself, stitching tiny patterns into the edges during long winter nights. The one she'd buried with. No. She stopped the thought cold. Her voice came out flat, hard. "Where did you get that?" The young woman stepped closer, holding the cloth gently. "You gave it to me. When you carried me through the storm. You said it would keep me safe." Lettie turned away, jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She didn't want this, didn't want these people here, dragging up memories she'd spent 12 years suffocating. But the woman kept talking, her words slow and deliberate. "I was 7 winters old. My family and I were traveling through the plains when the storm hit. We tried to find shelter, but I fell, hit my head on rock, started bleeding, couldn't wake up." She paused, her voice breaking. "My parents thought I was dying. They couldn't carry me anymore. The cold was too strong. They had to save the others." Lettie's hands trembled. She gripped the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. The young woman continued. "You found me, alone, in the snow. You didn't speak our language. You didn't ask questions. You just picked me up and started walking, for hours, through wind that would kill most people. You brought me to our healer, 12 miles through ice." She pointed to a faint scar along her temple. "This is all that's left, because of you." Lettie shook her head violently. "I don't remember." But even as she said it, fragments flickered in her mind, cold so brutal it burned. A small body limp in her arms, blood freezing against her hands, and her own voice, broken and raw, whispering the same words over and over. "Not this one, please, not this one." The elder stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting. He approached Lettie with careful steps, stopping just outside her reach. He spoke again, and the young woman translated. "He says you were crying when you found me. You kept saying a name, over and over, a child's name." Lettie's breath caught, her vision blurred. "He says you saved me even though you were dying inside, and we want you to know. It mattered. You mattered." Lettie's legs almost gave out. She gripped the doorframe harder, forcing herself to stay upright. The elder reached into his satchel again and pulled out something small, wrapped in soft leather. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a carved wooden figure. A horse. Crude but detailed, clearly made by hand. He held it out toward her. The young woman's voice was barely a whisper. "You dropped this, the night you saved me. We kept it. We wanted to return it." Lettie stared at the carving. She'd made it for her daughter, had spent weeks carving every detail, trying to make it perfect. Her daughter had carried it everywhere, and that night, the night everything ended, Lettie had grabbed it without thinking, shoved it in her coat pocket as she ran out into the storm, searching desperately for... She couldn't breathe. The memories crashed into her all at once. The accident, the frozen river, her daughter's body lifeless and cold. And then, hours later, stumbling through the plains in shock, finding another child dying in the snow, saving her because she couldn't save her own. Lettie sank to her knees. The elder knelt beside her, placing the wooden horse gently in her hand. And for the first time in 12 years, Lettie let herself feel everything she'd been running from. Lettie knelt in the dirt, clutching the wooden horse so tightly the edges cut into her palm. She couldn't look up, couldn't meet their eyes. The weight of 12 years pressed down on her shoulders like a collapsing roof. She'd convinced herself that isolation was punishment, that if she disappeared from the world, maybe the guilt would disappear too. But it hadn't. It lived in every silent meal, every empty room, every sunrise she watched alone. The young woman crouched beside her, careful not to touch. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You don't have to carry this alone." Lettie's throat burned. She wanted to scream at them to leave, to take their gratitude and go. But the words wouldn't come. Because part of her, The part she'd buried deep and tried to kill. Wanted them to stay. Wanted to believe that saving one life could somehow balance losing another. The elder spoke again, his tone low and steady. The young woman translated. He says grief is not a debt you owe. It's a river. You can't stop it, but you don't have to drown in it. Lettie shook her head, her voice cracking. I let her die. My daughter. I wasn't fast enough. I couldn't. She choked on the words, unable to finish. The young woman's eyes glistened. You couldn't save her, but you saved me. And because you saved me, I grew up. I had a family. I have a son now, 3 winters old. He's alive because you didn't give up that night. She gestured toward the others sitting nearby. All of us. We're here because you chose to keep going when everything inside you was broken. Lettie looked up slowly, her vision blurred with tears. For the first time, she really saw them. The elder with his weathered face and kind eyes. The young woman with her child's blanket still clutched in her hands. The others, men, women, a boy no older than 10, all watching her with something she didn't recognize at first. Not pity. Respect. They didn't see her as weak. They saw her as someone who'd survived the worst kind of pain and still found the strength to carry a dying child 12 miles through a storm. The elder reached into his satchel one more time. He pulled out a small bundle of dried sage tied with sinew. He placed it carefully on the ground in front of Lettie, then spoke in his language. The young woman translated. He says in our tradition, when someone saves a life, they become part of that person's story. Forever. You are part of mine, and I want to be part of yours, if you'll let me. Lettie stared at the sage. She didn't know their customs, didn't know what it meant. But she understood the gesture. They weren't here to take anything from her. They were here to give something back. Something she thought she'd lost forever. Connection. Lettie's hands shook as she reached for the sage. She held it carefully like it might break. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. The young woman smiled gently. You don't have to know. You just have to let us try. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and distance. Lettie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the wooden horse in one hand and the sage in the other. 2 pieces of a life she thought had ended. The elder stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. He gestured toward the others and they began unpacking supplies. Dried meat, woven blankets, clay jars filled with something Lettie couldn't identify. The young woman looked at her. We brought food and stories, if you'll share a meal with us. Lettie opened her mouth to refuse, to tell them she didn't deserve their kindness. But before she could speak, the boy, no older than 10, ran forward with a wooden bowl, holding it out toward her with both hands. His eyes were bright, hopeful, and Lettie realized something that made her chest ache. They weren't here to fix her. They were here because they understood what it meant to almost lose everything. And in that moment, she made a choice she hadn't thought she'd ever make again. She nodded. They sat in a circle outside Lettie's house, the sun climbing higher and warming the air just enough to soften the morning chill. The elder arranged small portions of dried meat and flatbread on a woven mat, handling each piece with care. The young woman sat beside Lettie, close but not too close, giving her space to breathe. Lettie held the wooden bowl in her lap, staring at the food like she'd forgotten what it meant to share a meal with another person. Because she had. For 12 years, every bite had been eaten alone, every silence unbroken. The boy who'd given her the bowl watched her with curious eyes. He couldn't have been more than 10 winters old, his dark hair falling across his forehead in uneven strands. He pointed at Lettie, then at himself, and grinned. The young woman laughed softly. He wants to know if you like horses. He saw yours in the corral. Lettie's throat tightened. She nodded slowly. I do. The boy's grin widened, and he launched into rapid speech, gesturing wildly. The young woman translated with patience. He says he wants to learn to ride like you. His father told him you crossed 12 miles through a blizzard without losing your way. He thinks that makes you the bravest person he's ever heard of. Lettie's chest ached. Brave. She hadn't felt brave in over a decade. She'd felt like a coward, running, hiding, letting the world forget she existed because she couldn't forgive herself for one terrible moment. She set the bowl down carefully, her hands shaking. I'm not brave. I was running that night, running from what I couldn't fix. The young woman looked at her steadily. And yet you stopped. You could have kept running, but you saw me and you stopped. Lettie's voice cracked. I didn't think, I just... She paused, searching for words that wouldn't come. I couldn't let another child die. Not when I could do something, even if it didn't matter. The elder spoke, his tone firm but gentle. The young woman translated. He says it mattered to me. It mattered to my family. It mattered to everyone sitting here. She gestured around the circle. My parents, my husband, my son. All of us exist in this moment because you didn't give up. Lettie looked around the circle slowly. She saw faces marked by hardship, by survival, by losses they'd carried and somehow learned to live with. They weren't here because they pitied her. They were here because they recognized her. They'd all walked through storms. They'd all lost things they couldn't get back. And they'd kept going. The elder reached for a piece of flatbread, tore it carefully in half and offered one piece to Lettie. She hesitated, then took it. He nodded once, approving, and took a bite of his own. They ate in silence for a while. Lettie chewed slowly, tasting food that wasn't just fuel for survival. It was connection. It was acknowledgement. It was a reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of something other than grief. The young woman finished her portion and looked at Lettie with quiet intensity. Can I ask you something? Lettie nodded, bracing herself. What was her name? Your daughter. The air left Lettie's lungs. She hadn't spoken that name aloud in 12 years. Hadn't let herself think it without drowning. But now, surrounded by people who'd traveled days to thank her for something she'd done in the darkest moment of her life, she felt something shift. Clara, she whispered. Her name was Clara. The young woman repeated it softly, with reverence. Clara. Then she placed a hand over her heart. Thank you for telling me. Lettie's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes roughly, angry at herself for crying in front of strangers. But the young woman didn't look away, didn't offer empty comfort. She just sat there, present, letting Lettie feel what she needed to feel. The elder spoke again, and the young woman translated. He says grief is the price we pay for love, and your love for Clara is still here, in everything you do, in the fact that you saved me. She lives in that choice. Lettie shook her head. I don't know if I can believe that. The young woman smiled gently. You don't have to, not yet, but maybe one day you will. And in that moment, Lettie realized they weren't leaving. Not today, maybe not tomorrow. They'd come to give her something she thought was gone forever, and she didn't know if she was ready to accept it. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. The visitors made no move to leave. They sat in the shade near Lettie's house, talking in low voices, occasionally laughing at something the boy said. Lettie watched them from the doorway, feeling something she couldn't name. Not quite peace, not quite acceptance, but something close to it, something that scared her more than the isolation ever had. Because if she let them in, if she let herself feel connected again, she'd have something to lose. And she didn't know if she could survive losing anything else. The young woman approached slowly, carrying a clay jar filled with water. She offered it to Lettie without words. Lettie took it, drank deeply, then handed it back. The young woman sat on the porch step beside her, staring out at the plains. You've been alone a long time, she said quietly. Lettie nodded. It's easier that way. The young woman tilted her head, considering. Is it? Or is it just what you're used to? Lettie didn't answer. The young woman continued. After you saved me, I didn't speak for 2 years. Not a single word. My parents thought I'd forgotten how. But I hadn't. I just didn't want to say anything that might make what happened real. She paused, her voice dropping. I was afraid that if I spoke about that night, I'd remember how cold it was, how scared I was, How my parents left me in the snow because they thought I was already gone. Lettie's breath caught. They came back for you. The young woman nodded. Eventually, but the fear stayed. The belief that people would leave me if things got hard enough. It took years to trust anyone again. Lettie looked at her, really looked at her. She saw the scar on her temple, the way her hands fidgeted when she spoke about difficult things, the way she glanced back at her family every few moments, like she needed to confirm they were still there. How did you move past it? Lettie asked. The young woman smiled sadly. I didn't move past it. I learned to carry it differently, and I let people help me carry it. She looked directly at Lettie. That's why we're here. Not just to thank you, but to help you carry what you've been holding alone. Lettie's jaw tightened. You don't owe me that. The young woman's voice was firm. Yes, we do. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. The elder wants to ask you something. Will you hear him? Lettie hesitated, then nodded. The young woman called out, and the elder approached, his steps measured and careful. He sat beside Lettie on the step, and the young woman crouched nearby to translate. The elder spoke slowly, deliberately. The young woman translated. He says his people have a tradition. When someone saves a life, that person is invited to join the family, not as a guest, as one of them. Lettie stiffened. I can't. The elder raised a hand gently, stopping her. He continued speaking. The young woman translated. He's not asking you to leave your home. He's asking if you'll let us visit. Let us bring food. Let us sit with you when the silence gets too heavy. Let us be part of your life, the way you became part of mine. Lettie's throat closed. She wanted to say no, wanted to tell them she didn't deserve kindness. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere deep inside, beneath 12 years of guilt and grief, a small part of her wanted to say yes. The elder reached into his satchel and pulled out a woven bracelet, simple but sturdy. He held it out toward Lettie. The young woman translated. He says in our tradition, this represents connection. If you wear it, you're saying you accept us, and we accept you. All of you, including the parts you think are broken. Lettie stared at the bracelet. Her hands trembled. She thought about Clara, about the river, about the storm, about the 12 years she'd spent punishing herself for something she couldn't change. And she thought about the boy who wanted to learn to ride horses, the young woman who'd survived, the elder who'd traveled days just to say thank you. Slowly, Lettie reached out and took the bracelet. Her fingers closed around it, and she felt the weight of it, real, solid, undeniable. The elder smiled, lines crinkling around his eyes. He stood, bowed his head slightly, and walked back toward the others. The young woman stayed beside Lettie. You don't have to put it on now, she said softly. Lettie looked down at the bracelet in her palm. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she slipped it over her wrist. It fit perfectly. And for the first time in 12 years, Lettie wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could learn to forgive herself. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the plains in shades of amber and rust. Lettie stood near the corral, watching her horses move lazily in the fading light. The boy had followed her, keeping a respectful distance but unable to hide his fascination. He pointed at the largest mare, a dappled gray with a scarred flank, and looked at Lettie with questioning eyes. She understood without words. Her name's Ash, Lettie said quietly. Had her since she was born. 15 years now. The boy's eyes widened. He spoke rapidly in his language, and the young woman who'd followed them both translated. He wants to know if you'll teach him to ride. Lettie's first instinct was to refuse, to close herself off again. But then she looked at the boy's hopeful face, and something inside her cracked open just a little more. Maybe, she said, if your parents allow it. The boy grinned so wide Lettie almost smiled back. Almost. The young woman stepped closer to the fence, resting her arms on the weathered wood. You've kept this place running alone all these years? Lettie nodded. Didn't have a choice. The young woman's voice was thoughtful. You always have a choice. You chose to stay, to survive. That takes strength most people don't have. Lettie's jaw tightened. Or stubbornness. The young woman laughed softly. Maybe both. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the horses. Lettie felt something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not quite peace, but close. The weight was still there. Grief didn't just disappear because 10 people showed up with gratitude and woven bracelets, but it felt different now. Less suffocating. Like maybe she could breathe around it. The young woman spoke again, her tone careful. "Can I tell you something?" Lettie glanced at her. "Go ahead." The young woman took a breath. "When I was 17, I tried to find you. I'd been searching for years. I asked everyone who traveled through the plains if they knew of a woman who lived alone, who'd saved a child during the worst storm anyone could remember." Lettie's hands gripped the fence rail. "Why?" The young woman's voice wavered slightly. "Because I needed to know you were real, that I hadn't imagined you. My parents told me the story, but I couldn't remember your face. Just the feeling of being carried, of someone telling me I'd be safe." She paused. "I needed to thank you, but no one knew where you'd gone. It was like you'd disappeared." Lettie's throat tightened. "I didn't want to be found." The young woman nodded slowly. "I know, but I never stopped looking. And 3 months ago I met a trader who'd passed through this area. He mentioned a woman who lived alone, miles from anywhere, who refused to trade or talk to anyone. Something about the way he described you, the isolation, the grief in your eyes, I knew it was you." Lettie turned to face her fully. "So you came." The young woman met her gaze steadily. "We all came, because you gave me life, and I wanted you to know that life has been worth living." Tears burned behind Lettie's eyes. She looked away quickly, focusing on the horses. The boy had climbed onto the lowest fence rail, leaning forward to get closer to Ash. The mare snorted softly but didn't move away. Lettie watched him, and for a moment she saw Clara. Saw the way her daughter used to climb that same fence, fearless and bright. The memory didn't hurt as much as it used to. It ached, but it didn't destroy. The young woman touched Lettie's arm gently. "You don't have to be alone anymore. We're not asking you to forget Clara. We're just asking you to remember that you're still here, and that matters." Lettie's voice came out rough, barely audible. "I don't know how to do this, how to let people in again." The young woman smiled. "You already started. You let us stay. You shared food with us. You told us Clara's name. Those are not small things." Lettie looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. The woven strands caught the evening light, each thread distinct but bound together. She thought about what the elder had said. Connection. Acceptance. The idea terrified her. But it also pulled at something deep inside, a part of her that had been dormant for so long she'd forgotten it existed. "Hope," the boy called out excitedly, pointing as Ash stepped closer to the fence. Lettie moved toward him instinctively, placing a hand on his shoulder to steady him. And in that simple gesture, she realized something that made her chest tighten. She was still capable of caring, of protecting, of being present for someone other than herself. The question was whether she'd allow herself to keep doing it. Night fell slowly over the plains, bringing with it a cool wind that carried the scent of distant rain. The visitors had built a small fire outside Lettie's house, and they sat around it in a loose circle, sharing stories in low voices. Lettie sat slightly apart, close enough to hear but far enough to retreat if she needed to. The boy had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, his face peaceful in the firelight. Lettie watched him, and for the first time in years, the sight of a sleeping child didn't break her. The elder stood slowly, stretching his stiff joints. He walked over to Lettie and sat beside her without asking permission. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them and the group. Finally, he spoke in his language, his voice low and measured. The young woman moved closer to translate. "He says we leave at dawn." Lettie's chest tightened. She'd known they couldn't stay forever, but hearing it made something inside her lurch. The young woman continued. Our village is 10 days' travel from here. We have responsibilities, people waiting for us. Lettie nodded stiffly. I understand. The elder spoke again, and the young woman's voice softened. He says this doesn't have to be goodbye. We want to come back, bring food, help with the ranch, teach the boy to ride if you'll let us. Lettie's throat closed. Why? You've done what you came to do. You thanked me. You don't owe me anything else. The elder shook his head firmly, speaking with quiet intensity. The young woman translated. He says you're wrong. This isn't about debt. This is about family. And family doesn't abandon each other. Lettie looked away, blinking hard against the tears threatening to spill. Family. She hadn't had family in 12 years, hadn't let herself even think the word. The young woman crouched in front of her, forcing eye contact. He's asking you a question. Will you let us come back? In 3 months, when the weather is warmer. Will you let us be part of your life? Lettie's hands trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to close the door, to return to the safety of isolation where nothing could hurt her because there was nothing left to lose. But then she thought about the boy's grin when she said maybe she'd teach him to ride, about the elder's quiet respect, about the young woman's determination to find her after years of searching, about Clara, who would never grow up, never laugh again, never climb the fence to pet the horses. And she thought about what the young woman had said. Your love for Clara lives in the choices you make. If she sent them away, if she locked herself behind walls again, what would that say about Clara's memory? That grief was stronger than love? That loss meant giving up? Lettie's voice came out rough, shaking. 3 months? The young woman nodded, hope flickering in her eyes. 3 months. We'll bring supplies. Stay a few days. Help you prepare for winter. Lettie looked at the bracelet on her wrist. The firelight made the woven threads glow like embers. She thought about the wooden horse in her pocket, about the blue blanket that had kept a dying child warm, about 12 years of silence that hadn't healed anything. And she thought about the terrifying, fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to live again. She met the elder's eyes. He waited patiently, no judgment on his weathered face, just acceptance, just the quiet offer of connection. Lettie took a shaking breath. Okay. The word came out barely above a whisper. 3 months. The elder's face broke into a smile. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and placed his hand over hers. The touch was gentle, respectful. He spoke one word in his language, and the young woman translated. Family. Lettie's tears finally spilled over. She didn't try to stop them. The young woman squeezed her shoulder. You're not alone anymore. Even when we're not here, you're not alone. Lettie wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that this fragile thread of connection wouldn't snap the moment they left. But fear still gripped her chest. What if she let them in and then lost them? What if she opened herself up to caring and it destroyed her all over again? The elder seemed to sense her fear. He spoke again, his voice firm but kind. The young woman translated. He says courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to move forward despite it. You've already done the hardest part. You let us in. The rest will come. Lettie wiped her eyes roughly. What if I can't do this? What if I... The young woman interrupted gently. Then we'll be here to help you try again. That's what family does. Dawn broke cold and clear. Lettie stood outside her house, watching the 10 visitors prepare for their journey. They moved with quiet efficiency, rolling blankets, securing packs, checking supplies. The boy was still half asleep, rubbing his eyes as his mother tied his coat tighter against the morning chill. The elder approached Lettie one final time. He placed both hands over his heart, then extended them toward her. The young woman translated. He says thank you, for letting us honor you, for accepting us. Lettie's throat tightened. I should be thanking you. The elder shook his head gently. He spoke again, his voice steady. The young woman translated. He says you gave me life twice. Once when you carried me through the storm, and again today when you chose to live instead of just survive." Lettie looked at the young woman, no longer the 7-year-old child bleeding in the snow, but a mother, a wife, someone who'd built a life because Lettie hadn't given up that night. The young woman stepped forward and embraced her. Lettie stiffened at first, then slowly, carefully, let herself return it. They held each other for a long moment, two people connected by grief and survival, and the fragile hope that tomorrow could be different than yesterday. When they pulled apart, the young woman pressed something into Lettie's hand, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Open it after we leave," she whispered. Lettie nodded, unable to speak. The boy ran over, tugging on Lettie's sleeve. He pointed at the horses in the corral, then at himself, his eyes bright with excitement. The young woman laughed softly. "He's reminding you that you promised to teach him to ride." 3 months. Lettie looked down at the boy, and for the first time in 12 years, she smiled. Not a big smile, not an easy one, but real. 3 months, she said. The group began walking, their figures growing smaller against the vast plains. Lettie stood watching until they disappeared beyond the first ridge. Then she was alone again. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Not oppressive, not suffocating, just quiet. She looked down at the bundle in her hand and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small carved figure. A woman on horseback, her face tilted upward, hair flowing behind her. Beneath it, scratched carefully into the wood, was a single word in English. Brave. Lettie's vision blurred. She held the carving close to her chest, feeling the weight of it. The weight of being seen, of being remembered, of mattering to someone. She walked slowly back into her house. It looked the same. Bare walls, simple furniture, nothing unnecessary. But something had shifted. She set the carved figure on the table beside the wooden horse she'd made for Clara. 2 pieces of her life. One she'd lost, one she'd saved. Both part of who she was. Lettie moved to the window and looked out at the plains stretching endlessly in all directions. For 12 years, she'd seen this view as a prison, a place to hide from a world that had taken everything. But now, standing here with a woven bracelet on her wrist and the promise of visitors in 3 months, she saw something different. Space. Freedom. A life she could choose to fill however she wanted. She thought about Clara, about the river, about the storm. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it wasn't the only thing anymore. Lettie walked outside and headed toward the corral. Ash lifted her head, snorting softly. Lettie ran her hand along the mare's neck, feeling the warmth of living muscle beneath her palm. 3 months, she said quietly. "I need to get you ready. There's a boy who wants to learn." The horse snorted again as if in agreement. Lettie leaned her forehead against Ash's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and earth and animal warmth. She was still alone, but she wasn't lonely, not anymore. Because in 3 months 10 people would return. And when they did, she'd be here, waiting, ready, alive. She looked at the bracelet on her wrist, the threads catching the morning light. Connection, family, hope. She'd spent 12 years believing she didn't deserve any of it. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She'd been punishing herself for being human, for failing to save someone she loved more than life itself. But Clara wouldn't have wanted this, wouldn't have wanted her mother to disappear into silence and grief. She would have wanted Lettie to live. And now, finally, she could try. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to discover another powerful tale from the frontier, where courage and redemption collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us bring you more stories like this one. Your support means the world to us.